The human mind is a meaning-making machine. It does its best to make sense out of the constant barrage of information flooding it moment to moment. One of the ways your mind does this is by creating and using filters. These filters go by many names: cognitive bias, heuristics, core beliefs, values, narratives, prejudice, and many more. In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we explore how these filters work for us and against us, and discuss how you can become the author of your own internal story. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. A few quick announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for comprehensive foundational training in psychedelic-assisted therapy that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our courses. We're offering 10% off select courses to PTF podcast listeners, so click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/training, and you can use the code PTF10 for that 10% discount. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinous Network does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/research, where you can learn more about the trials we're currently running. Finally, if you'd like to support our show, here's how you do it. Leave us a rating or review in a place like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and please share the episode with somebody you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here is today's episode on how stories, self-narratives, and bias shape our mental health. So Reid, there are a lot of things that separate us from the other animals on the planet. And
you and me?
Just us. And I think one of those things is the way we use language. And been thinking a lot about the stories and the narratives, the language we use to interpret our experience and think about ourselves.
Compared to your dog.
Yeah, I mean, maybe my dog's got stories. I don't know. It seems like all his stories revolve around eating and making a mess and sitting on my lap and staring me straight in the face when I'm trying to work.
And are told concisely or with limited vocab, perhaps.
Exactly. But yeah, the stories we tell ourselves about experience and about us can really determine the quality of our life, whether or not we feel like we're suffering or thriving. And so we've come at this from a couple different angles on the podcast over the years, but thought it might be interesting to talk about narrative styles or self-narratives, or like I said, the stories we tell ourselves and how we can investigate that, inquire about it, and maybe shape it a little bit so that we can live lives thriving instead of feeling trapped by these stories.
Yeah, because this is how we construct our sense of self, our ego, if you will, like by the narratives we hold. And sometimes, as a survival mechanism, we'll hold some self-deception, if you will, to, for lack of a better term, but as a way of reducing the very uncomfortable cognitive dissonance of holding on to those truths and the mental discomfort that comes with it.
Yeah. And when you describe it as a survival strategy, it makes me think of one particular cognitive style that we refer to as the negativity bias. And you can think of the negativity bias from like an evolutionary lens, a survival strategy lens. And the negativity bias is that we have a tendency to notice things that are threatening, notice things that are scary, notice things that threaten not only our physical sovereignty and safety, but social sovereignty and safety. And we notice them and hold on to them a little bit more than we do things that are comfortable or things that are positive. And you can imagine that being really helpful in our evolutionary sort of history, that we would have a bias toward noticing things that could harm us or could result in ostracization from a safe social tribe or community, right? But in modern day, the negativity bias can sometimes work against us. We have this tendency to notice negative things. And so if that's, like if you think of people who struggle with social anxiety, you might be picking up on what are small, subtle cues from others and over-interpreting it. Like, oh, this person must think I'm weird, or I have to make sure I perform perfectly in this social context, or else I'm going to be rejected. And you mentioned self-deception. Oftentimes, because of this negativity bias, we are really deceiving ourselves about reality. that people don't tend to think about us as much as we think about us. People don't tend to judge us as much as we're judging ourselves. So this is an opportunity to notice, and we'll talk about ways to notice these styles and edit our narratives, but an opportunity to notice the ways in which this negativity bias, in this case, is holding us back instead of serving us.
Yeah. I like how you sum that up. Yeah. And it just on the evolutionary front, for a minute, I was reading this article on Substack by a fella named Gerwinder. I don't know who it is, but it was a cool name and a well-written article about how it's called Why Smart People Believe Stupid Things. I think we've shared it.
We've talked about that before.
But intelligence is not rationality. And in this article, he points out that, you can be intelligent about any variety of things, but what is that intelligence directed at? Rationality, like as an example, is intelligence in pursuit of objective truth. So that's one form, but just one of many. And what's interesting evolutionarily is, like you were saying, we use these mechanisms, these cognitive biases, if you will, to preserve, not just our emotion regulation and our social adaptation tribes, but also our sense of self-esteem, if you will. And so this article by Gerwinder was talking about how it was a Yale professor, Dan Kahan. I don't know how to say his last name, but he did this study maybe 10 years ago, testing intelligence and ideological biases or political, and looked at using this cognitive reflection test, the reasoning ability and that type of intelligence in liberals and conservatives, and found they scored roughly the same. But interestingly, the people scoring the highest in both groups were more likely, like highest in these numerical accuracy categories, especially more likely to show biases. And then it was replicated and everything. And it's kind of counterintuitive at first, but then you look at the other fields of research, like in artificial intelligence, there's this orthogonality thesis that talks about how these AI agents can be intelligent at their task, but totally not in the big picture. And so he talks about tribal signaling. This is what I wanted to get at, and says an absurd ideological belief is a form of tribal signaling. It signifies that one considers their ideology more important than truth, reason, or sanity. To one's allies, it's an oath of unwavering loyalty. To one's enemies, it's a threat display. Like we were talking about before, like if you have the strongly held belief around the earth being flat, that may be more just part of your identity that you're carrying with you. And he says when intelligent people affiliate themselves to ideology, their intellect ceases to guard against wishful thinking and instead begins to fortify it, causing them to inadvertently mastermind their own delusion and to very cleverly become stupid, if you will. So he's talking about intelligent people are more easily misled by themselves, and unintelligent people more easily misled by others.
Right. Yeah, I've liked that. When you've shared it before, I like that phrase, masterminding your own delusion. So, maybe somebody who's quote unquote intelligent has more cognitive horsepower to ways to explain away things that disprove their belief system and maintain their belief system.
You're good at mental gymnastics, essentially. Yeah. And like, I think if you put yourself in a therapy room, like with a therapist, for example, and I've thought this many times when I've been doing my own work in that setting, is like it's important to put aside our mental gymnastics and ability to navigate that world and that language and those narratives to really be open to examination, Yeah.
You mentioned cognitive dissonance, and I think, this drive to resolve cognitive dissonance, meaning I've got two beliefs or a sets of information that are dissonant, they don't agree with each other. We want to resolve that. We can resolve it by a number of ways. One would be to creatively come up with reasons to continue believing what we're believing and discredit the disconfirming evidence, or it would be to question what you already believe. And for somebody who maybe has an identity as a smart person, right? You were talking about intelligence. That might be the harder lift, to actually consider the fact that you could be wrong about something. And so you're more invested in maintaining your belief, and it makes these people who have that skill, have that cognitive horsepower, more vulnerable to staying stuck in those beliefs.
Yeah, it's harder. You fall harder from that high height, perhaps, and more to lose, things like that. Speaks to the social status and the self-esteem motivations for sure. And social status meaning very real, like tribal associations for survival, where it stems from. But yeah.
And your point about ideology, like those are maybe sort of one way to think about modern tribal affiliations is with a particular ideology, whether it's a religious ideology or a political ideology, that we want to, like was described in this study, signal to the in-group that we're part of the in-group to maintain the safety of ideological affiliation, and signal to the enemies that we are a threat to them, right? So all very evolutionary, if you think about it, survival strategy.
And you know how we've shared here both our own reflections and some quotes from kind of enlightened gurus about the more you go through life and the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And I think it's very literally true in some ways. Like one example is I'm reading this book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. And Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics back maybe 15 years ago for his behavioral economics. Essentially, he was bridging economics and psychology in proving that humans are not 100% rational in their thinking and decision making. Like the main theory was prospect theory, like showing how people make their decisions under risk. And as an, like, I guess an example would be, it's similar to the biases you were talking about. Like one he calls the availability heuristic. When someone judges the likelihood of an event based on how easily they recall similar examples from their memory. Like you've heard a plane crash in the news, and so you are overestimating the risk of flying. And we would all do that naturally. Unless we check that assumption, which you can do. The one thing I love about thinking is you could be like, okay, our minds give more weight to the vivid, emotionally charged stuff. So let's be aware of that and take a pause. But the one thing I wanted to point out about his book is the main message is that we have two systems of thinking, hence the title, Thinking Fast and Slow. System one, fast, automatic system that takes the path of least resistance, relies on shortcuts, these like heuristics. Yeah. And so we make these snap judgments, but then there's system two that is slow, deliberate, uses problem solving and attention. And that is what we might call in other terms, like just taking a mindful pause or really sitting with something and like tuning into it and evaluating it from other angles and challenging our own beliefs and assumptions and biases and heuristics.
Yeah, I think thinking about biases in terms of cognitive heuristics is helpful. A heuristic being like a mental shortcut.
Yeah.
Influenced by all those factors mentioned, including availability bias, and the recency bias and fundamental attribution error, like all these different terms to describe how we deceive ourselves into believing things that are more comfortable for us and make us not rational computers. The economists would love us to be rational computers, right? Because then they could predict behavior, and behavior would then, that predictable behavior would then affect sort of market decisions and things like that. But
I can picture half the room full of old economists at the Nobel Prize ceremony just cursing Daniel's name, saying like, you're complicating our field.
I mean, one of the things that comes out of there that, of behavioral economics is this idea of loss aversion. People they're generally more averse to losing what they already have than to gaining something better. And there's like a heavier weight to sort of
Yeah.
losing what they have than gaining something better. If you were to look at it perfectly rationally in a case where, surely this person would discontinue something they're doing in order to get this better thing, but because they already have it, and there's this phenomenon in human psychology of losing something that they don't want to lose, they behave irrationally as a result.
I think these are good to know about yourself. Like we talk about know thyself and awareness being half the battle, or just this is an example of how if you know the kind of default reflexive shortcuts your mind takes because we are wired that way, then you can be armed with that information to look beyond it for a more balanced view as you make important decisions, right? And that loss aversion's a fun one. It's one of the classic ones in the book, and he cites a study where they tested it using mugs. Like they gave half the group mugs, a coffee mug, and asked them, how much will you sell this for? And then another group is asked, how much would you pay to buy the same mug? And the sellers demanded way more than the buyers offered because they felt losing the mug was more painful than just the joy of gaining it.
Yeah, interesting, right?
Yeah. So ownership increases the value of an object, even if it's trivial, like the endowment effect, he calls it.
I wonder if conceptually the sunk cost fallacy is related to this, where, let's say you're really dissatisfied with your career, but you've put on this time and this money to get the education that you have and achieve the position that you're in. And so you're less likely to change. You're less likely to pivot to a new career.
Yeah, I think
but the
so.
costs, the sunk costs, meaning that the costs you've already put into developing your career, your expertise to put you where you are sunk, meaning they're irretrievable.
Yeah.
So this decision still could be beneficial to change your career if that's what you really, really want to do, but it's harder to do because you don't want to acknowledge that the costs are sunk. So hard to move on. Maybe there's a loss aversion parallel there.
I remember taking Econ 110 as a freshman and finding it equal parts challenging but fascinating. And the biggest thing I took from that is this statement that was just drilled into a sunk cost don't matter. And it was kind of like it rocked my world a little bit to just try and integrate that because you're like, wait, it feels like they matter sometimes.
It certainly does.
Yeah. I've invested all this.
Back to feeling states, right? That we're not perfectly rational beings. And a lot of what motivates our decisions are often unconscious drives to feel a certain way and not feel another way.
Yeah. Do you want a couple other examples from his book of biases? One of them has the word Steve in it, so I just want to share it. It's the base rate neglect. So if I told you that 90% of the people in a room are engineers and 10% are lawyers, people still rely more on personality descriptions, like Steve is argumentative, to guess Steve's profession than on the base rate. So remember, there are 90% engineers. People are going to guess that the argumentative Steve is a lawyer, but the probabilities don't support that in that room. So we ignore them to focus on our stereotypes. Yes, that's base rate. Kind of similar to the what you see is all there is. Like you're hiring someone, they have a degree from Harvard. You're like, yay, hire them. But ignoring their complete inability to work on a team or something like that. Yeah. But another one that I find really useful in terms of managing mental well-being is the peak end rule. Like this idea that our memory of experience is not based on a sum of the event, but on specific moments, especially the peak and the end. So if your vacation had like a really rough ending, it might be kind of downgraded in your memory banks to a less desirable one because the flight home was a shit show. But like if you're undergoing a painful colonoscopy, you might rank it based on the most intense moment and the end.
Yeah, it makes me think about this concept of cognitive heuristics and how necessary they are in some ways, but how they get in our way in other ways. Because we only have so much, cognitive energy, and we need the shortcuts. It would be very difficult for us to very carefully and rationally sort of look at all the data of experience in each moment in order to understand what to believe about a thing or to make a decision in a moment. So in some ways, these cognitive heuristics really serve us. But in other ways they don't. And, I'm thinking of applying this to the mental health world. Like you could make the argument that a core belief, so from the CBT world, like a negative core belief is a type of cognitive heuristic, a shortcut, a stereotype about yourself.
Yeah.
So the idea that, for instance, you are unlovable is this shortcut that you just accept at the level of consciousness is true. You identify with that identity of unlovable. And all the data you get from experience is filtered through this heuristic, this narrative, you could even say, about yourself, which causes a bias for information that confirms this idea that you're unlovable. Oh, that person, I waved at them and they didn't wave back. That must mean I'm unlovable. But you're also ignoring all the times when people did wave back, right? You're discounting those things.
So I like CBT. One of the most evidence-based practical therapy modalities we have that's still the gold standard or the best, most effective one for a number of conditions. Like, we're talking about like binge eating disorder, for example. We're doing a study of it in our research clinic in Draper. I work with all sorts of eating disorders. And that's, that's an interesting one where CBT has like the most benefit of the things it seems that have been tested. But I'm wondering if someone wants to employ CBT tactics on their own to challenge some of these beliefs, like how would they go about it? I know there are strategies with therapists like Socratic questioning or a thought record. Like, how would you advise someone to try out some of that stuff?
Yeah, you can start with the proposition that not everything I think is the truth. So you mentioned thinking about thinking or metacognition.
Yeah, that's a good initial reaction when faced with a decision or a conundrum.
Yeah. So a common CBT exercise is examine the evidence. So if you start with the proposition, like I said, that not everything I think, not every thought that occurs to me is a realistic appraisal of myself or my environment, then I can sort of take a closer look and examine the evidence. So back to my example of being unlovable. Okay, what evidence do I have in support of that claim? The person didn't wave back. Got it. Any other evidence? Well, not really in this moment. Okay, is there any evidence to the contrary? Well, my wife did decide to stay with me at dinner, and we had quite a nice conversation, and she even paid me a compliment. Okay. So you probably, based on just that short analysis, cannot support the claim that wholesale, I am not a lovable being.
Yeah.
So you might still feel unlovable because a lot of times the core beliefs come from, these really, really old experiences when our nervous systems and personalities and brains were developing. So it can still feel true, even if objectively you've now discovered that it isn't technically true, but it's a good place to start. And then also educating yourself, and what part of the sort of CBT protocol is also educating the client about these things you're talking about so-called cognitive distortions, the ways in which we fool ourselves or keep ourselves in a state of suffering. Like a common one is catastrophization, where you take one thing and you blow it out of proportion. You turn it into a catastrophe. So the person not waving at me is a horrible thing. It means no one will ever love me. All is lost.
You're bringing up the value of psychoeducation in the therapy equation too, and something that people can really empower themselves with, acknowledging that it's hard to know where to begin and where to look for good information besides our podcast.
Yes. Well, the part of this episode idea was to provide some psychoeducation.
Yeah.
Right? At least introduce the idea that you are not everything you think, and that not every idea that occurs to you is necessarily accurate. It might be a heuristic that no longer serves you.
Yeah. What do you think of Byron Katie's The Work? Those 4 questions, which seem to kind of be drawn from that CBT approach, and before that, like the Socratic by Socrates, perhaps. Right.
Yeah, I think it's just another example of an inquiry process that helps you think about the thinking and the implications of your thinking.
Yeah.
Like, is this true? Can you know absolutely that it is true? What would you be like? What would it feel like if you didn't believe this thought?
Yeah.
What would you want to do if you didn't believe this thought? That's a rough approximation of Byron Katie's The Work.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's those questions. Well, I guess number 3 is, how do you react what happens when you believe that thought? And then the 4th would be, who would you be without that thought? Mm-hmm. I think just having your own set of questions where you challenge your beliefs, I think is what it's about. You're essentially pausing, knowing that system 1 is working fast for you all the time, but pausing and engaging system 2 especially when you want to analyze, when you're taking a moment to, observe yourself, but also when you're faced with important decisions or a fork in the road of some kind, and you really want to have good, clear thinking and balance the rational and the emotional in a wise-minded, kind of holistic view of the world.
So the phrase wise mind makes me think of another framework for doing this work, and that's acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT.
Yeah.
Pioneered by the psychologist Steve Hayes, who I got to see at APA, American Psychological Association conference, when I was in grad school. And I was pretty enamored with ACT because I liked the combination of the great stuff from CBT, but the introduction of mindfulness and sort of thinking about thinking. And he's an interesting guy, but he talks about just the power of narrative and language. Is kind of where we started. And how you can sort of use it to also engage in system 2 thinking. So he would say things like, you have the thought, nobody loves me. Take a pause, mindfully reflect, and then maybe edit it a little bit so that instead of nobody likes me, it is, I am having the thought that nobody likes me.
Yeah, it's a mental event, essentially.
There you go. I'm a being that has mental events, and not all the mental events are
accurate. I could ask 100 people and do a validated survey and prove that, right?
And so he has all these exercises to help you get a little cognitive distance from that thought.
That'd be cool if you had dissonance building exercises. Not cool. Not cool.
Plenty of those. One of his famous ones is, so say it again to yourself, the negative thought, but say it in the voice of your favorite cartoon character.
Yeah.
Like, just notice that, and I think he would do that just so he could demonstrate his Daffy Duck impression or Donald Duck impression. I think he did that in a TED Talk or something like that. Exactly.
Yeah.
And, or say it over and over and over again. Or another example is, just to show that thinking isn't destiny, open and close your hand and say to yourself over and over again, I cannot open and close my hand. So you're using language to assert the truth of something, but then you have
doing
actual data to suggest that thought isn't destiny. And I remember doing this with some of our clinicians in a training, and one of our colleagues he's like, yeah, it was almost trippy, like got in this weird sort of altered state of, oh my gosh, I am not what I say in my mind all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can diffuse these self-deceptive thoughts, these false beliefs, essentially, by recognizing that they're just little blips in the weather patterns of your awareness, mental events, rather than the rock solid, lasting, objective reality truth.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is where mindfulness comes to bear in acceptance and commitment therapy, is taking the observer's seat.
Yeah.
So I'm watching this weather pattern event in my psyche, and I don't have to attach to it. And use the word diffuse. In ACT, he talks about the difference between cognitive fusion and cognitive, he calls diffusion. Fusion being, I have fused my identity with this idea, this belief.
You can uncouple it or cut the fuse. Yeah, before it blows. I don't know.
Different use of the word fuse, but yeah. Still applicable,
Yeah. No, ACT is awesome. So it reminds me of kind of this transpersonal, psychospiritual perspective, if you will. and a parable that I've heard read by many a Zen teachers, and I've heard it, including Alan Watts, heard it shared by Ram Dass and others. But you cool if I read it?
Yeah, like a good parable.
You may have heard, but I like hearing it over and over. So let me know what you think. There's a story of a farmer who had a horse that ran away. His neighbor came by and said, "Oh, that's terrible." The farmer said, "You never know." The next day, the horse came back, and it was leading 2 other wild horses. The neighbor said, "That's wonderful." And the farmer said, "You never know." Later, his son was training one of the wild horses, and while riding the wild horse, he fell off and broke his leg. The neighbor came by and said, "That's terrible." The farmer said, "You never know." The Cossack army came through recruiting everybody, taking away all the able young men. They didn't take the farmer's son because he had a broken leg. The neighbor came by and said, "That's wonderful." And the farmer said, "You never know." And so it goes.
Yeah, I have heard that parable before, and I like it. It's a good lesson in, the phrase he repeats over and over again. You never know. Your initial appraisal might not be an accurate appraisal, like we keep saying.
Yeah, good and bad judgments, if you hold those in your mind, that may be a sign of kind of an incomplete narrative or a faulty narrative, meaning like something, good things and bad things, quote unquote, happen. But if we can withhold the judgment of that, acknowledging the tragedy, and really making space for that and what it is and what it needs, like to feel and hold that. But we can kind of still be open, leave room, if you will, for the good stuff to come. Good. I'm doing it again. The other stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the potentially really, really helpful things about having a more mindful perspective, displayed by this parable, is that it opens you up to the richness of experience. So something happens and this heuristic might convince you that it is all good or all bad, but that heuristic limits your aperture, right? It closes your aperture and limits your experience of experience. And so to say, well, you never know, allows you to, for instance, feel the sadness in all its richness. The sadness of loss could be both really painful, but it also could be communicating to you how important this thing that you lost is to you. So it could be also very clarifying.
Yeah.
So yeah, it instead of putting a moratorium on what you can't experience, it opens up possibilities.
Yeah, and it applies, I feel, these days more than ever. Like we're in, a world that's stressed out. Yeah, tumultuous times indeed, and it's really easy to get tripped up and freak out around whatever the day's events are, and new, health secretary put in place or whatever's going on. I think it's really helpful to zoom out and look at us as all these little vulnerable humans, and hold the compassion for that. And we all have the similar hopes and wishes of to be happy and free, right? To be well. And sometimes there is a silver lining, or there may be, to some shakeups and change that feels disruptive. But one thing that strikes me is just the working on our ability to hold the uncertainty, to hold that space for what may still come, what good may come. That kind of stance of openness is not easy, but worth practicing.
Yeah. Hold the ability to just sort of cope with chaos and uncertainty, I think, is quite the superpower, and a skill worth working on and developing, for sure. Reminds me of another sort of story or parable of a man walks up on another guy digging through an enormous pile of horse manure. And he's like, "Well, what are you doing? That seems like messy work." He's like, "Well, if there's this much shit, there's got to be a horse in there somewhere." Where normally we would have an aversive reaction to a big pile of horse shit. But yeah, again, to the point about opening up possibilities. Another actism, like when dealing with a feeling that would generally be a little intolerable, like anxiety, where we would normally seek to resolve or quell that anxiety quickly through, pick your favorite coping strategy, running away, food, alcohol, whatever distraction. this increases your ability to feel the feeling and move forward anyway. So instead of, no, this is too much, I can't do it, it's, I can feel anxious and do it anyway. So again, to the point of opening up possibilities, if you can take that observer's seat, be open to the full aperture of experience, and not be ruled by your heuristics.
Yeah. And we're talking about a lot of these biases or potential traps or shortcuts, the efficiencies that the mind has that we got to be aware of. But there's a framework of putting it all together in our kind of developmental journey, sometimes called self-authorship. I think it's Baxter Magolda who's done a lot of research on this, but this concept that you can define your own beliefs and identity and social relationships independently, rather than being kind of those being dictated by
Signed
authority.
to you, yeah.
And there is a journey that we go through in life of following these prescribed formulas or wearing the suits that other people give us. And then a stage of like a crossroads where you're questioning, and then hopefully leading to this place of being the author of your own life. And the way Magolda puts it is there are three parts of this, like the epistemological dimension of like how we know, how we go about knowing things, and the interpersonal, like who we are, and then interpersonal, how we relate. And so I think that's been helpful to kind of weave it together in like, where are we going with this, or what are we doing with as we integrate kind of these things we're learning?
Yeah. Maybe one way of thinking about that is using our tendency to form heuristics in our favor.
Yeah.
So I gave a bunch of examples of how those heuristics, shortcuts, those biases can hold us back. But if we create them on purpose, like you're describing, and maybe as they would say in ACT, in accordance with your values, then you've got these shortcuts to return to relative to your identity or how you know things, like the epistemological variable there, that really serve you. And I wrote a few down, and I call these orienting self narratives. So narratives about yourself that orient you in a particular trajectory or the filter through which you experience the world, that are more consistent with your values. And we actually use a lot of these on the show, right? Inspired by people like Ram Dass or others, but the idea that we're all just walking each other home.
Yeah.
Or that we are the universe experiencing itself. Or even things like, I am a child of God, or I am already enough. I am worthy of love. You can't do it all perfectly, so take it easy on yourself. These value-based rules that could help you be pretty resilient in the face of a lot of distress.
Yeah, I'll give you an example that's been really helpful for me, because we like to talk about triggers on here, and when we get triggered, there's often a reaction, like into these cognitive biases, like, oh, they're awful, this reaction. But from one other example of these places to draw values-based wisdom is A Course in Miracles, as for example, where I remember one line in it. I've dabbled in it because it's interesting the way it's written.
Controversial too.
Yeah,
I will add, but
yeah, totally. Like the origin story is super weird, but when I like to kind of look at things and even try them on. And in this case, like there was this one line that says, everything you perceive as an attack coming from another is actually a call for love. And like, think about what that does when someone's yelling, like say a significant other is yelling at you. Like if you could remember, oh, they're kind of suffering, and that they actually do love you, even if it doesn't feel like it in that split second. And this is actually a cry for love. What will you do then? Yeah. How will you hold that?
Yeah, it's a great way to calibrate to your values. And of course, there are scenarios in which you would want to protect yourself from somebody who's reacting to you poorly.
Some attacks need a shield,
right?
And
there you go,
an exit plan.
Yeah, but I do like that idea. It made me think of sort of one of these heuristics that I've developed in my own relationship, in my own marriage, that is based on lots of good data of trust and having each other's back. But it is give my partner the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
So the benefit of the doubt, meaning if my partner reacts in a way that's fairly triggering for me, I can sort of take a mindful moment and remember, you know what, it's not super risky for me to give her the benefit of the doubt, and it almost always pays off. And it's a way to maintain love and connection and trust and safety in the
Instead of
relationship.
reflexively assuming the worst, malintent, sinister intentions, whatever. Yeah.
Well, and you used another one recently on the show, sort of coming off of your Ram Dass retreat, and that is, it's all grist for the mill, right?
Yeah.
So another slogan or idiom or heuristic that could serve you, being mindful of the ways in which you're activated and triggered, that would force you to reject experience, but like, oh, maybe there's a lesson in this.
Thank you for the triggers that make me stronger, shake me awake, that give me the curriculum to work on, things like that.
Yeah. I would say if you're looking for a way to guide the creation of these heuristics for you, these orienting self narratives, if it invites compassion for self and others, then you're probably on the right track. It's part of why I really like the concept from internal family systems of no bad parts.
Yeah.
That's another way to sort of view oneself and what shows up in yourself in a way that I think is healthy and constructive. So yeah, I might have this tendency to, I don't know, push people away when they get too close. And I've been to therapy and I've learned that that's not serving me.
Yeah.
But if I can start with the premise that there are no bad parts, maybe this part of me that pushes people away was created for a reason. Maybe I can slow down and investigate that reason and do some loving self-improvement as opposed to just like chipping parts of myself away.
Yeah, that's sounds like a beautiful approach. And you can use these things like we were talking about earlier, like the peak end rule of the intense moments and the ending are the most memorable. So say you're thinking of your closest and valued relationships in life, including like homework everywhere. And how, if you can kind of have some peak experiences together, if you can kind of strategically plan things so they're wound down in a positive way, that's what people are more likely to go away with, a positive experience. Yeah.
I wonder, like in your example of the vacation, right? If you know this about the human mind, if you could deliberately on your flight home do some savoring, like do some mindful savoring, so that you can take advantage of that recency effect and just like reflect on the best parts of the trip. Not that there weren't hard parts, but sort of be deliberate about it, like you're saying.
And I think there's a lot of good evidence to back up that strategy from a number of angles. It reminds me of when my kids were little, and think about having identical twins and going on vacations. I remember planning a couple trips to Disneyland where we strategically inserted, after the couple days of Disneyland mayhem, a beach to relax on for a couple days after that to balance it out.
It's a great example.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of other ways you can sort of compensate for the negativity bias. And they are the things that you often hear out of our mouths on this podcast and other therapists, but it's things like a daily gratitude practice where it's so easy to take for granted the things that actually make our lives pretty great because of this negativity bias. So deliberately focusing on, and I like this word savoring. Remember, like really appreciating savoring when we talked to Eric Garland about his MORE protocol, the mindfulness oriented.
I like that he has savoring as a big part of it. I think that's so bright, smart, useful.
So a gratitude practice. One of the things you mentioned, we talked about CBT for a second. One of the things in CBT is the sort of the cognitive reappraisal after doing that evidence like examine the evidence exercise. After you've examined the evidence, now you sort of reappraise what happened and reframe the negative thoughts that reduces their negative emotional impact with this new data.
Yeah. And then like in those domains of self-authorship, like how, I think you could take an inventory of like, how do you decide that you know something? And, or how would you move from blindly following expert advice to critically analyzing different viewpoints and forming your own conclusions? Like, but in the who you are department, like how, and this would be a good writing exercise. How might you define your personal success based on your own values? We talk about values, card sorting, other ways of getting those front and center, but rather than societal measures of wealth, success. And I think like the young generation these days is certainly challenging the prescription from generations before of just work 9 to 5, get your mortgage and do it like we did in a world that just has gotten even more and more expensive and messy. Yeah.
I like that idea of this appraisal, this sort of inventory on the pressures externally, culturally, ideologically that are responsible for the creation of your narratives. Yeah. And so, like you're saying, if you want to be the author of your own sort of life and meaning, you can do it deliberately. And one of the ways to do it deliberately is to take this inventory and sort of discard the narratives that were foisted upon you.
We should make an inventory.
Yeah, there you go.
But, I think it would be super useful to list it out. You just as a starting point, like what, of course, from parents, from all the early influences, from the culture we're raised in, what are the expectations and how do I really feel? Yeah. And then you could do that with your relationships too. Like you can go through them and see, do these align with your values and respect the boundaries that you would like to be respected, and how much of your interrelating with others is driven by seeking approval and just being aware. Yeah.
Is it David Foster Wallace that gave the commencement speech, "What is water?" or "This is water"?
Yeah.
Yeah. What you're describing kind of made me think of, the old fish that swims up to the young fish and says, "How's the water, boys?" And the young fish are like, "What the hell is water?"
David Foster Wallace is such a brilliant writer, thinker. I highly recommend that to myself to reread because it's been a minute.
It's one of those ones you want to read like once a year. You want to revisit it. But speaks to this phenomenon that without the inventory process, without the inquiry process, then you might be swimming around in some toxic waters, I guess, and not even be aware.
Once again, the ancient Eastern philosophies and approaches to what we call psychology were certainly onto something eons ago in their practice of self-inquiry.
Yeah. Oh man, my old philosophy education is now percolating to the surface. Plato's cave, assuming that the shadows are actually what's casting the shadows and getting out of the cave. And
yeah, we just visited that one in our philosophical musing. There's also Dostoevsky, who said it takes something more than intelligence to act intelligently. Dostoevsky. That's right.
People are screaming at their cell phones right now.
Apologies.
You guys can't pronounce.
Yep. Speech biases. Have I been umming a lot today? I have no awareness of that.
I wasn't. I
Sometimes
too
I
had no
do.
awareness of it.
Yeah. Well, did we cover everything there is to cover on
We always do.
self-deception?
We always do. Our podcast episodes are comprehensive and thorough.
Self-deceived
And
podcasters.
not just ramblings.
But, or did we hit our time limit
I
buzzer?
think we're good. Yeah. So just, I guess, in summary, not everything you think or believe is necessarily true. You are not what you think. And if you want to author yourself throughout life, maybe do that in a way that involves introspection, inventory, and values, and see where it takes you.
Lovely. Well, it's been a pleasure, Steve.
As always. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network, a company committed to helping people heal and be well by delivering technology-driven clinic support, clinical trial research, and comprehensive practitioner training in psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about Numinous Network at numinous.com. That's numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the YouTube videos, and share the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you're interested in comprehensive training in psychedelic-assisted therapy, check out our courses at numinous.com/training. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals like myself, Reid, and others, and include live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space. I really love teaching these courses and connecting with you all, so check out numinous.com/training, and I hope to see you at the next training cohort. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.